case of Luther's time, the person who played the greatest role and had the strongest influence on passing on Luther's insights to the next generations was Philip Melanchthon.
Melanchthon was actually called the Preceptor Germani, the teacher of Germany. In recognition of his role, we know that teachers have a great influence on a movement, and Melanchthon was no exception. He shaped the curriculum and content of German higher education by reforming curriculums and writing textbooks. These things certainly played a large role in passing on the Lutheran teaching.
But Melanchthon's most prominent legacy is found in two documents, the Augsburg Confession and the Loci Communes, Latin for the commonplaces. Both documents deeply shaped the way future generations understood themselves as Lutherans, even to this day.
The Augsburg Confession, written and presented publicly in 1530, was the cornerstone of the movement. If you want to learn more about the Augsburg Confession, we have several episodes dedicated to it. Put briefly, though, it served as a marker in the ground, a public confession, laying out what Lutherans believed and stood for.
The Loci Communes, on the other hand, was the textbook of Lutheran teachings. It explained the content of the confessions and the basic beliefs Lutherans held. Luther was once asked what pastors should have as resources in their library. He said the Loci Communes was one of those things all pastors should have.
Now, while Luther did say that, there is a little controversy surrounding the claim that Luther endorsed the Loci Communes as an invaluable resource. At the time Luther made this statement, Melanchthon had written only one edition, so he was clearly referring to that first edition.
Melanchthon would go on to edit it 3 more times, however, and each time the textbook changed and got a little thicker. It's not clear if or how Luther's opinion on those later editions changed.
As I mentioned earlier, understanding Melanchthon is critical to understanding Lutherans even to this day. So we're going to spend a little time now talking about who he was and how he ended up as Luther's right-hand man.
Melanchthon, unlike Luther, was born into a family of sound financial standing. This afforded him the opportunity to have formal schooling at an early age. Part of that schooling included learning several languages. Additionally, he was trained in a method of education called Studia Humanitatis, sometimes also called Renaissance humanism.
Renaissance humanism was an educational movement that promoted an educational foundation and curriculum based upon what is referred to as the trivium. In other words, the curriculum was based on an education in grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. One of the calling cards of this approach to education was the understanding that it was necessary to go back to the sources of thought and philosophy in the education process. The Latin term for that approach is ad fontes, go back to the original sources. This was in opposition to other methods of the time, which relied on commentaries written about the original sources and not studying the original sources themselves.
Prior to his exposure to the Studia Humanitatis, Melanchthon's earliest schooling exposed him to the purer philosophy found in the Latin and Greek poets, something about which he gave mixed reviews of his later years in education. And it also included a very strong emphasis on formal logic. On one hand, Melanchthon had disdain for the emphasis upon logic. This is how he put it. There, nothing was taught publicly to the youth other than that garrulous dialectic and parts of physics. This comment typifies Melanchthon's sentiments regarding the scholastic-oriented curricula of his time. And he also wrote this: "As a boy, I did some damage to my mind in preoccupation with their frivolous and trifling disputations."
So, what was Melanchthon's concern about exactly? He was following in the footsteps of many other humanists at the time. He, like other humanists, admitted that logic is important and needed to be used. The problem came in, however, when logic itself became the standard for truth. In other words, Melanchthon and others recognized the value and role of logic in education and in making an argument. But where they drew the line was using logic to comment on the individual issues in the text. When it was used in that way, they believed then the text was consumed by logic rather than logic being used as a tool to parse and decipher the text.
Melanchthon's views on education were certainly not arrived at in a vacuum. He was influenced by a number of people, including Rudolf Agricola. Agricola sought to demonstrate how conviction was produced through the function of logic in the context of sound rhetorical orations. In other words, he's known for his emphasis on using logic in the art of rhetoric and dialectic.
Agricola was not the only person to have helped shape Melanchthon's views on education, and specifically on the use of limitations of logic. Jakob Wimfelling, a professor of rhetoric, taught along the lines of Agricola as well, and also influenced Melanchthon in this area. Wimfelling taught about a concept called genus demonstrativum. This was a class of rhetoric that went beyond simple emotive or emotional persuasion. And the way to move beyond emotional persuasion was to use logic to make your case. To do this, Wimfelling taught the necessity of reincorporating the structures of rhetorical and dialectical persuasion. This was a direct incorporation of Aristotelian logic.
You might find yourself asking at this point, why does this matter? The reason we're talking about this has to do with Luther's complaints against the use of Aristotle in theology. Luther argued very strongly against using Aristotle and logic when it came to Scripture. At the heart of Luther's critique was the effect dialectical philosophy had on the interpretation of Scripture. He also criticized the use of metaphysical rules and categories in theology as it tended to warp the biblical language. Theology and dialectics, rhetoric, were two distinct and separate things for Luther.
In addition to learning these methods of communication and teaching, Melanchthon furthered his mastery of Greek as part of the ad fontes drive back to the original languages of Scripture. 3 months before arriving in Wittenberg, he had published the influential Institutiones Graecae Grammaticae, a Greek textbook. So, he had fully established himself as a linguistics scholar before coming to the University of Wittenberg.
It was actually that area of expertise that had called Melanchthon to Wittenberg to serve as a language teacher. Elector Frederick the Wise of Saxony was looking for a professor of biblical languages, and he chose Melanchthon as his new Greek scholar.
Melanchthon rode into Wittenberg on August 25, 1518, to start his new job at the university. 4 days later, he stood before the faculty and students to give his opening address. The speech was titled On Improving the Studies of Youth. In that speech, Melanchthon clearly raised his banner of humanistic studies with his opening remarks. And in doing so, of course, Melanchthon justified the usefulness of his position as a professor of Greek, because with Greek language came a wide range of primary sources and resources. Not only did Greek open up the Scriptures, but it also made available the ancient philosophers, including the philosopher of primary importance, Aristotle.
Melanchthon's arrival in Wittenberg in August of 1518 was not just happenstance. It was part of an intentional and ongoing process of reforming the curriculum at the university, in particular, the liberal arts and theology. Earlier in the year, Luther and his colleagues had been discussing the usefulness of dialectics, the centerpiece of the liberal arts studies in scholastic curriculum. But Melanchthon was doing something different. He had been trained on how to use Aristotelian logic to teach something, and he proposed a new way of looking at Aristotle's work as a whole.
Rather than using Aristotle to undergird a speculative system of metaphysics as its essential nature and purpose, Melanchthon was convinced that Aristotle had been motivated by much more practical concerns than those of the scholastic metaphysicians.
Specifically, Melanchthon believed Aristotle's thought had not been driving toward otherworldly truth, which is how the scholastic metaphysicians were using Aristotle, but rather toward this world. The true essence of Aristotle's system, Melanchthon and others believed, was its scope and teleological function as rhetoric.
In other words, they believed and advocated for a positive relationship between rhetorical and logical methods as being essential to the success of humanistic studies in the schools and even society broadly speaking. Because you need to be able to teach coherently and function in a variety of other vocations, logic was understood to be essential, but not the basis of a curriculum.
As I mentioned earlier, one of Melanchthon's greatest and actually earliest contributions was a theological textbook called Loci Communes, Latin for commonplaces. The task of a theological textbook was to put the doctrines and ideas in a nutshell. Melanchthon wrote about his approach to this task as follows: I am discussing everything sparingly and briefly, because the book is to function more as an index than a commentary. I do this not to call students away from the scriptures to obscure and complicated arguments, but rather to summon them to the scriptures if I can.
In keeping with his understanding of the proper use of Aristotelian logic, Melanchthon used Aristotle's rhetoric and logical sequencing, but not his metaphysical rules to explain things. That means that there was a particular way of setting up a document in order for the argument to flow and be convincing, and logic was certainly in full force to do that.
Melanchthon ended up revising the Loci Communes 3 more times over the course of his lifetime, and each edition was expanded and nuanced. And by that I mean that with each edition, Melanchthon inserted more and more of his own ideas as he explained in more detail what may have been slightly more ambiguous in the first edition.
Of course, as you may suspect, each time he did that, more questions arose as to just how accurately Melanchthon was reflecting Luther's ideas. This is bound to happen, of course, because, as you know from everyday experience, the more you try to explain something, the more you run the risk of losing sight of what you were originally trying to explain.
And so when it comes to Melanchthon, the question remains whether or not his alterations in the later editions of the Loci Communes were intentional or accidental.
While we may never be able to answer that question, we do know that from the start to finish, Melanchthon was a teacher, with a teacher's heart. He was instrumental in setting up the educational system of the Reformation for all ages and all levels, a system that included the education of girls, by the way. And he had a hand in shaping the curriculum of the modern liberal arts.
We also know that he never became a theologian by training. He refused to take the exam which would have given him the credentials, even though Luther encouraged him to become a doctor of theology. Instead, Melanchthon steadfastly remained a teacher, an educator of language, and the Studia Humanitatis.